The steel deck vibrated beneath Oberleutnant zur See Werner Hartenstein's boots as he gripped the periscope housing, his knuckles white in the crimson glow of the control room lighting. U-156 had been submerged for 68 hours now, the men breathing stale air that tasted of diesel fuel and fear. They were 300 miles west of the Azores, in waters that had once belonged to the wolf packs. Now, in the first week of August 1943, these same hunting grounds had become a trap. Through the periscope, Hartenstein scanned the empty horizon for what must have been the 100th time that watch. Empty, just like the last watch. And the watch before that, but he couldn't risk surfacing. Not yet. Not while that sound hung in the water, a faint mechanical drone that his hydrophone operator had picked up 6 hours earlier. The sound of aircraft engines, circling, waiting, hunting. The Americans had transformed the Atlantic into a killing ground, and Hartenstein was beginning to understand that the hunter had become the hunted. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The tactical situation had reversed itself so completely, so swiftly, that many U-boat commanders simply refused to believe it. Just 4 months earlier, in March 1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz's submarine force had been winning the tonnage war. The mathematics were simple, elegant, and seemingly unstoppable. German U-boats were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Britain was being strangled. Victory, Dönitz had promised, was inevitable. The numbers from March 1943 painted a picture of impending Allied collapse. In that single month, German submarines sank 82 merchant ships, totaling over 500,000 gross registered tons. Convoy battles had become slaughters. When wolfpacks of 20 more U-boats descended on a convoy, they could sink a dozen ships in a single night. The crews spoke of these as happy times, echoing the glorious summer of 1940 when U-boats operated off the American coast with near immunity. But something had changed. Hartenstein felt it in his bones, in the nervous exhaustion of his crew, in the way every man flinched when the hull creaked or a pipe rattled. They had departed Lorient on July 10th, exactly 27 days ago. In those 27 days, U-156 had spotted exactly 2 merchant ships. Both times, Hartenstein had been forced to break off his attack approach before even reaching firing range. Both times, aircraft had appeared, forcing emergency dives that left the submarine clinging to the bottom while depth charges hammered the water above. The aircraft. That was the problem. The aircraft were everywhere now, patrolling in patterns that seemed to anticipate where U-boats would be before the submarines themselves knew. And these weren't the lumbering shore-based patrol planes that U-boats had learned to evade. These were carrier-based aircraft, operating from small escort carriers that could range anywhere in the Atlantic, could maintain patrols for hours on end, could hunt submarines with a persistence that bordered on the supernatural. Hartenstein's war diary, kept in precise naval German, documented the transformation. His entries from the first week at sea read like those of any U-boat patrol. Contact with enemy shipping, maneuvering to attack position. Then, the entries changed. Aircraft contact, emergency dive. Aircraft contact, remaining submerged. Aircraft overhead, cannot surface. By the third week, the diary had become a chronicle of frustration and growing dread. No surface running possible. Air batteries are critical. Crew morale deteriorating. The technical limitations of Type 7C submarines had always been known but rarely mattered during the happy times. A Type 7C could make 17 knots on the surface using its diesel engines, but only 7 knots submerged on electric batteries. More critically, the batteries lasted perhaps 18 hours at patrol speed before requiring recharge. To recharge them, the submarine had to surface and run its diesels. For 5 years of war, this had been manageable. U-boats surfaced at night, recharged their batteries, and dove before dawn. The Atlantic was vast. The chances of encountering an enemy during the vulnerable hours of darkness were small. But in August 1943, the Atlantic wasn't vast anymore. Somehow, Impossibly, the Americans had covered it with aircraft. Hartenstein knew from intelligence briefings that the Americans were deploying small escort carriers, crude vessels converted from merchant hulls, carrying perhaps 20 aircraft. Simple mathematics suggested this shouldn't matter. The Atlantic Ocean covered 31 million square miles. A carrier air group could patrol perhaps 10,000 square miles in a day. The numbers simply didn't add up. There weren't enough carriers, there weren't enough aircraft to make the ocean this dangerous. Yet here Hartenstein sat, 68 hours submerged, his batteries showing 15% charge, knowing that when he surfaced, an aircraft would likely appear within minutes. The mathematics made no sense, but the reality was undeniable. The Americans had solved a problem that shouldn't have been solvable. What Hartenstein couldn't know from his sealed steel tube 300 miles from land, was that the American solution wasn't about coverage. It was about tempo. The escort carriers weren't trying to patrol the entire Atlantic. They were creating zones of absolute denial, areas where U-boats simply couldn't operate, couldn't surface, couldn't recharge. And they were doing it with operational methods that no naval planner in 1939 would have considered possible. On the surface, 500 miles to the northwest of Hartenstein's position, Lieutenant Commander Arnold J. Isbell stood on the bridge of USS Card, watching his flight deck crew prepare the fifth Avenger launch of the day. The Casablanca-class escort carrier rolled gently in the Atlantic swells, her small flight deck, just 500 feet long, looking absurdly inadequate for launching aircraft. Yet, in the 48 hours since Card had arrived in this patrol sector, her Avengers had launched every 4 hours, regular as clockwork, searching expanding squares that interlocked with previous searches to create an invisible net of surveillance. Isbell, dual-hatted as both the carrier's commanding officer and the hunter-killer group commander, understood what he was doing in a way that the U-boat commanders hunting his merchant ships could not. He wasn't trying to find submarines. He was trying to make it impossible for them to operate. Every 4-hour patrol forced U-boats to remain submerged. Every hour, submerged drained their batteries. Every day spent underwater brought them closer to the moment when they would have no choice but to surface, regardless of risk. The TBF Avenger torpedo bombers that launched from Card's deck had been designed to attack surface ships, but they had been repurposed into submarine hunters with remarkable speed. Each Avenger carried a 3-man crew, a pilot, a turret gunner, and a radio operator who also served as radar operator. The aircraft was slow, cruising at around 190 miles per hour, and it was unmaneuverable compared to fighters. But it had range, an internal fuel capacity of 325 gallons that could be supplemented with drop tanks, giving it the ability to stay aloft for 8 hours or more. More importantly, each Avenger carried the latest airborne search radar, a microwave set designated ASD that could detect a surfaced submarine at 12 miles. The radar sets weren't perfect. They produced frequent, false contacts from waves or floating debris, and they required skilled operators who could distinguish a submarine's return from ocean clutter. But when they worked, they transformed the hunt. The operational pattern Card employed had been developed through painful trial and error during the spring and early summer of 1943. The first escort carriers assigned to anti-submarine duty had tried to escort convoys, providing air cover for the merchant ships. This had proven ineffective. The carriers were tied to the convoy's slow speed, unable to pursue contacts aggressively. Their aircraft were constantly pulled back to defend the convoy when U-boats approached. In May 1943, the Americans had made a radical decision. Instead of escorting convoys, the escort carriers would form independent hunter-killer groups. These groups, typically composed of 1 carrier and 3 to 5 destroyer escorts, would operate away from the convoy routes, in areas where intelligence suggested U-boats were congregating. They would be free to hunt, to pursue contacts for days if necessary, to maintain continuous patrols that made it impossible for U-boats to operate effectively. The concept required a level of operational tempo that seemed impossible. A carrier had perhaps 12 to 18 aircraft available for patrol at any given time. These aircraft had to be launched, flown on patrol, recovered, refueled, rearmed and relaunched. The maintenance requirements were staggering. Each Avenger needed approximately 40 man-hours of maintenance for every flight hour. The aircrew needed rest. The deck crews needed sleep. The aircraft themselves needed repairs, replacement parts, engines that wouldn't quit at the worst possible moment. Yet, Card's air group had developed a rhythm that maximized their coverage while maintaining the grueling pace. 4 aircraft would launch at dawn, each assigned a search sector. They would patrol for 4 hours, pushing at their fuel reserves to the limit, then return. While those 4 aircraft were recovering and being refueled, another 4 would be launching. The cycle repeated every 4 hours, dawn to dusk. 12 hours of daylight produced 3 complete patrol cycles, meaning that the ocean within 200 miles of Card was searched 3 times daily. At night, the pattern changed. 1 or 2 Avengers with the most experienced crews would launch with extra fuel tanks instead of depth charges. They would fly through the darkness, their radar sweeping the ocean, not to attack, but simply to be present. The sight of an aircraft, the sound of its engines, would force any U-boat that had surfaced to recharge immediately back underwater. The night patrol aircraft didn't need to sink submarines. They only needed to deny them the surface. The human cost of maintaining this tempo was severe. Card's pilots were flying 2 or 3 missions every 24 hours. The deck crews worked 18-hour days in all weather. The maintenance crews performed miracles of improvisation, cannibalizing damaged aircraft to keep others flying. Men worked until they collapsed, slept in 4-hour shifts, and returned to work still exhausted. The operational pace violated every regulation about crew rest, every guideline about safe flight operations, but it worked. In the 6 weeks since Card had begun hunter-killer operations in late July, U-boat contact reports had dropped by 60% in her patrol area. Merchant ship sinkings had virtually ceased. The submarines were still out there, but they were spending their time hiding, not attacking. Battery charges that should have taken 4 hours were taking 3 days because U-boats couldn't risk surfacing. Patrols that should have lasted 8 weeks were being cut short after 4 because submarines couldn't remain in the patrol area without draining their batteries to dangerous levels. Lieutenant Junior Grade Sam Balliet banked his Avenger into the search pattern's next leg, his eyes scanning the ocean below while his radio operator monitored the radar scope behind him. They had been airborne for 3 hours and 20 minutes, patrolling a square that covered 6,000 square miles of empty Atlantic. It was mind-numbing work. The ocean below looked the same in every direction. The radar scope showed nothing but occasional false contacts that disappeared when investigated. The engine droned on, steady and reliable, but Balliet knew that every hour of flight time brought them closer to the moment when something would fail, when the engine would cough, when the controls would jam, when the aircraft would betray them at the worst possible moment. This was the 5th patrol mission Balliet had flown in 48 hours. He had 4 hours sleep total in that time, snatched in brief periods between missions. His body ached from sitting in the cramped cockpit, his eyes burned from scanning the endless ocean. His mind felt sluggish, struggling to process the radar operator's reports and maintain the navigation plot. Yet Balliet understood, in a way that made him fiercely proud despite the exhaustion, that this was the new warfare. Not the dramatic dogfights that the public imagined, not the precision bombing that the newsreels showed, but this endless, grinding, unglamorous patrol work that starved the enemy of the sea room they needed to operate. He was part of a machine that never slept, never relented, never gave the U-boats a moment of safety. Far below, Oberleutnant WWII Hartenstein was making his decision. U-156's batteries were at 12%. If they dropped below 10%, the submarine wouldn't have enough power to maneuver if attacked. They had to surface. They had to recharge. The risk didn't matter anymore. Hartenstein gave the order. U-156 rose from the depths with painful slowness, her depleted batteries barely able to power the electric motors that drove her upward. At 60 meters depth, Hartenstein raised the search periscope for a quick scan. Empty horizon. He waited 3 minutes, the longest 3 minutes of his life, then raised the attack periscope for a full sweep. Still empty. At 30 meters, he paused again. The hydrophone operator reported no propeller sounds, no aircraft engines, just the ambient noise of the ocean. U-156 broke the surface at precisely 1100 hours local time. Hartenstein was up the conning tower ladder before the deck hatches opened, his binoculars sweeping the sky in all directions. Empty. Clear. They had perhaps 4 hours of charging ahead of them if they weren't discovered. 4 hours to restore their batteries to operational levels. 4 hours of vulnerability. The diesel engines roared to life, their familiar thunder both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant power was flowing back into the batteries. Terrifying because every merchant ship and every aircraft within 20 miles would hear them. The lookouts scrambled onto the bridge, 4 men whose sole job was to scan the sky for the telltale dot that meant discovery and death. 28 minutes later, at 11:28, the port lookout screamed a warning. Aircraft, bearing 270, altitude low. Hartenstein's heart hammered as he swung his binoculars. There, a dot on the horizon, growing larger. An Avenger. Of course it was an Avenger. It was always an Avenger now. The distance was perhaps 8 miles. At the Avenger's approach speed, they had perhaps 3 minutes. Hartenstein's mind raced through the calculations. Crash dive would take 90 seconds. The Avenger would close to attack range in 2 minutes. They wouldn't make it, but staying on the surface meant certain destruction from the depth charges the aircraft carried. Hartenstein gave the order. Alarm. All hands below. Crash dive. The klaxon sounded. Men tumbled down hatches. The diesel engines cut off. The vents opened. U-156's bow dipped as seawater flooded into her ballast tanks. 70 seconds later, the submarine slipped beneath the waves with her batteries barely more charged than when she had surfaced. Hartenstein sat in his tiny captain's cabin 30 minutes later, his hands shaking slightly as he wrote the day's entry in the war diary. Surfaced for battery charge. Forced to dive by aircraft contact after 28 minutes. Battery charge insufficient. Will attempt to surface run after dark. He paused, his pen hovering over the paper, then added a sentence that captured the new reality of submarine warfare. Cannot explain how aircraft located us so quickly. Either they have constant patrols over the entire Atlantic, which seems impossible, or they have some method of detecting our position we do not understand. Recommend all boats exercise extreme caution. The ocean is no longer safe. What Hartenstein had experienced was the result of mathematical precision applied to operational tempo. Lieutenant Commander Isbell had launched Balliet's Avenger at 1000 hours for a 4-hour patrol. The search pattern Balliet flew wasn't random. It was calculated to overlap with previous patrols, creating continuous coverage. Every 4 hours, new aircraft launched to patrol the same areas, ensuring that any U-boat that surfaced would be spotted within approximately 30 minutes. The system wasn't perfect. U-boats could surface at night and recharge unmolested if they were lucky. Bad weather could ground the Avengers for days. Mechanical failures could break the patrol rhythm. But the system worked often enough, predictably enough, that it transformed submarine operations from hunting expeditions into survival struggles. The transformation that men like Hartenstein were experiencing in the water, men like Isbell were engineering from the surface. But the true architects of this revolution sat in offices thousands of miles from the battle. In Washington, Admiral Francis Lowe commanded the 10th Fleet, a fleet that existed only on paper but controlled the most sophisticated intelligence operation of the war. Lowe's staff received ultra-decrypts of German naval communications, high-frequency direction-finding bearings on U-boat radio transmissions, and position reports from merchant ships and patrol aircraft. This information was synthesized, analyzed, and used to position hunter-killer groups where they would have the greatest effect. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The intelligence advantage was profound, but it was also fragile. The Germans couldn't know that their Enigma codes were compromised, or they would change their encryption methods and the advantage would evaporate. This meant that ultra-intelligence had to be used carefully, indirectly, in ways that could be explained by other means. When Lowe's staff identified a U-boat refueling rendezvous through decrypted messages, they couldn't simply send a hunter-killer group directly to those coordinates. Instead, they would position the group in the general area and rely on the aircraft to conduct visible searches that would eventually locate the submarines. The system worked because the Germans believed their codes were unbreakable. They attributed their losses to radar, to bad luck, to superior Allied seamanship. They never suspected that every radio message they sent was being read by their enemies within hours, sometimes minutes. German U-boat command would order a submarine to proceed to a specific position for refueling. Within 3 hours, Admiral Lowe's staff would know those coordinates. Within 12 hours, a hunter-killer group would be moving into the area. Within 24 hours, Avengers would be flying search patterns over the rendezvous point. For the U-boats, this created an experience that bordered on the paranormal. They would arrive at secret rendezvous coordinates known only to themselves and U-boat command, and within hours, American aircraft would appear. The submarines began to suspect betrayal, sabotage, anything that could explain how the Allies seemed to anticipate their every move. The truth, that their communications were transparent to the enemy, was too devastating to consider. Captain Lieutenant Klaus Bargston commanded U-521 on her third war patrol in September 1943. An experienced commander with 18 months of Atlantic operations, Bargston had survived the transition from the happy times to the new warfare. His war diary entries documented the psychological impact of the hunter-killer groups with painful clarity. September 3rd, 1943. Proceeding to refuel the rendezvous per orders. Position 45 degrees north, 32 degrees west. Expected rendezvous with U-460, a Type 14 tanker submarine, at 2200 hours. September 4th, 1943. Arrived at the rendezvous position at 2100 hours. No contact with U-460, remaining submerged pending further orders. September 5th, 1943. Surfaced at 0400 to recharge batteries. Aircraft contact at 0423. Emergency dive. This is the third consecutive rendezvous where Allied aircraft have appeared within minutes of our arrival, beginning to question the security of radio communications, though this seems impossible given Enigma's design. What Bargston couldn't know was that U-460 had been sunk 2 days earlier by aircraft from USS Card. The Avengers had caught the tanker submarine on the surface, refueling U-464. Both submarines had attempted to fight back with their deck guns, a decision born of desperation rather than tactical sense. The Avengers' 50 caliber machine guns had killed most of the gun crews. Depth charges had done the rest. U-460 had gone down with all hands. U-464 had escaped, damaged, and unable to complete her refueling. The sinking of the tanker submarines, the milch coup or milk cows as the Germans called them, was particularly devastating to U-boat operations. These large Type 14 submarines carried no torpedoes, only fuel and supplies to extend the operational range of combat U-boats. One tanker could refuel 6 or 8 combat submarines in the mid-Atlantic, allowing them to patrol for weeks longer than their internal fuel capacity permitted. The tankers were the logistical backbone of the long-range patrol system. The hunter-killer groups hunted the tankers with particular intensity. Ultra-intelligence usually revealed when and where refueling operations would occur. The 10th Fleet would vector a hunter-killer group to the area and maintain continuous patrols until the submarines appeared. Between May and December 1943, American escort carrier groups sank 6 of the 10 operational tanker submarines. The loss rate was unsustainable. By early 1944, Dönitz would be forced to abandon mid-ocean refueling entirely, sharply reducing the effective patrol time of his combat submarines. The continuous patrol tempo that made this hunting possible exacted a severe toll on the Americans as well. Lieutenant Junior Grade Donald Witter, flew his 43rd combat mission on September 23, 1943. He was 23 years old and had been in the Navy for 18 months. He looked 40. The flight surgeon had recommended grounding him for exhaustion 3 weeks earlier. The recommendation had been noted and filed. There weren't enough pilots to ground anyone who could still fly. WWII's logbook documented the grinding pace. September 1st through September 7th, 14 missions, 56 hours flight time. September 8th, weather grounded all flights. September 9th through September 15th, 16 missions, 61 hours flight time. September 16th through September 22nd, 13 missions, 53 hours flight time. In 22 days, WWII had flown 43 missions, totaling 170 hours in the air. His hands shook when he tried to write. His eyes couldn't focus properly. He had trouble remembering the names of his crew members. On September 23rd, flying his afternoon patrol, WWII spotted a surfaced U-boat at the extreme range of his search pattern. His radio operator confirmed the radar contact. The submarine was 8 miles away, running on the surface, charging batteries. Standard procedure was to close to the attack range, approximately 1 mile, then commence the bombing run. But WWII's exhausted mind skipped several steps in the attack sequence. He pushed the Avenger into a dive from 6 miles out, forgetting to arm his depth charges. The U-boat, identified post-war as U-238, spotted the Avenger at 3 miles and crash-dived. By the time WWII reached the dive point, the submarine had been under for 90 seconds and was already at 50 feet depth. WWII's depth charges, had they been armed, would have exploded harmlessly on the surface. As it was, the unarmed charges simply sank. WWII didn't realize his error until he was back aboard Card, and the ordnance crew pointed out that the arming switches were still in the safe position. The incident was noted in WWII's service record, but not punished. Everyone understood that mistakes were inevitable when men were pushed beyond human limits. The question wasn't whether pilots would make errors, but whether the errors would be fatal. WWII had been lucky. His mistake had merely cost an opportunity. Other pilots made mistakes that cost lives, their own and their crews. The accident rate for escort carrier operations was staggering. Between May 1943 and May 1944, US escort carriers operating in the Atlantic lost 43 aircraft to operational accidents, meaning crashes, mechanical failures, and pilot error. During the same period, they lost 18 aircraft to enemy action. The hunter-killer campaign was killing more American aviators through exhaustion and mechanical failure than the Germans were killing with anti-aircraft fire. Yet the campaign continued because it worked. The statistics compiled by the 10th Fleet told a story that justified every risk, every sacrifice. In March 1943, before the escort carriers began intensive hunter-killer operations, German U-boats sank 82 Allied merchant ships. In August 1943, after 3 months of continuous carrier patrols, the number dropped to 25 ships. By December 1943, the monthly sinking rate had fallen to 13 ships. The U-boat force, which had nearly won the Battle of the Atlantic in March, was being strangled by May. The German response to the carrier offensive revealed how completely they misunderstood what they were facing. Dönitz ordered U-boats to fight back against attacking aircraft, reasoning that the small, slow Avengers would be vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. He equipped submarines with additional deck guns, 20mm and 37mm cannon, and ordered commanders to remain surfaced when attacked and shoot it out with the aircraft. The results were catastrophic. U-boats that fought back were devastated by the Avengers' 50-caliber machine guns, which could fire from longer range and with greater accuracy than the submarine's cannon. The aircraft would circle outside the submarine's effective range, riddling the deck with bullets that killed gun crews and perforated the thin pressure hull. Then, with the submarine's defences suppressed, the Avenger would make its bombing run unopposed. Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Hartmann commanded U-418 during her 7th War Patrol in October 1943. Following orders to fight back against aircraft, Hartmann had drilled his gun crews extensively. When an Avenger from USS Block Island appeared on October 17th, Hartmann kept U-418 on the surface and manned his guns. The engagement lasted 4 minutes. The Avenger's radio man gunner, aviation machinist's mate second-class Robert Williams, fired approximately 800 rounds from his 50 caliber turret gun. 17 bullets struck the submarine's conning tower, 4 penetrated into the control room, 3 killed crew members, 7 more caused wounds. The pressure hull was holed in 2 places. U-418 crash-dived with water pouring through the bullet holes. Emergency damage control managed to shore the holes temporarily, but the submarine was crippled. Hartmann had no choice but to surface and surrender. Block Island's destroyer escorts took U-418's crew prisoner and sank the submarine with gunfire. Hartmann's war diary, recovered from the Denver 30 Intos submarine before it sank, contained a final entry. Attempted to fight aircraft per orders. The results were disastrous. Aircraft weapons superior to ours in range and accuracy. Recommend immediate abandonment of standing orders to engage aircraft. This vessel is lost. The crew will be captured. This was preventable. By December 1943, Dönitz quietly rescinded the order to fight aircraft. U-boats would dive immediately when aircraft appeared, accepting the disruption to battery charging rather than risking annihilation in unequal combat. But the damage was done. In the 6 months that U-boats attempted to fight back against carrier aircraft, 23 submarines were sunk in surface engagements with Avengers and Wildcats. Only 2 aircraft were shot down. The exchange rate made the policy's failure obvious even to the most optimistic German naval planners. The hunter-killer groups achieved their greatest success in the area west of the Azores, a region the Germans called the Black Pit because it had been beyond the range of land-based Allied aircraft until mid-1943. For 2 years, U-boats had used this area as a safe haven, a place to refuel, to make repairs, to reorganize after convoy battles. The arrival of escort carriers transformed the Black Pit from sanctuary to killing ground. USS Card, under Commander Dixwell Ketchum, operated in the Black Pit from June through November 1943. Card's Air Group, Composite Squadron 13, flew an average of 6 patrols per day throughout this period, maintaining the relentless 4-hour cycle that defined carrier operations. In 5 months, Card's aircraft sank 6 U-boats and damaged 8 more. More importantly, they forced dozens of submarines to abandon patrol areas and return to port with depleted batteries and demoralized crews. The psychological impact on U-boat crews equaled the physical losses. Kapitänleutnant Johann Mohr, commanding U-184, wrote in a letter to his wife that was captured when the submarine was sunk in November 1943. "The ocean has become impossible. We cannot surface without aircraft appearing within minutes. We cannot recharge batteries. We cannot attack convoys because we must remain submerged to avoid the aircraft. The men are exhausted beyond description. We sleep in shifts of 2 hours, always ready for the alarm that signals another emergency dive. I have been at sea for 6 weeks, and we have fired exactly 4 torpedoes, all missed because we could not maneuver into a proper attack position. This is not warfare. This is slow death." The continuous operations that created this oppressive presence over the Atlantic pushed American capabilities to their limits. Escort carriers were small ships, displacing only about 10,000 tons compared to the 30,000 tons of fleet carriers. They had limited fuel capacity, limited ammunition storage, and limited spare parts. A typical hunter-killer cruise lasted 4 to 6 weeks, during which the carrier operated far from any base, depending entirely on what she carried with her. The maintenance burden was extraordinary. Each TBF Avenger required 40 hours of maintenance per flight hour. With aircraft flying 8 to 12 hours daily, this meant maintenance crews worked around the clock. Engine changes, which ideally should be performed in well-equipped shore facilities, had to be accomplished on pitching flight decks using improvised tools. Damaged aircraft that would normally be sent to depot-level repair facilities had to be cannibalized for parts to keep other aircraft flying. Chief Aviation Machinist's mate Robert Henderson served aboard USS Guadalcanal during her hunter-killer operations in early 1944. His personal log, preserved in the National Archives, documented the desperate improvisations required to maintain the operational tempo. January 15th. Number 7. Aircraft lost an engine on landing. The cylinder head cracked. No replacement engines available. Removed engine from number 12 aircraft, which had damaged wing from deck handling accident. Installed in number 7. Total time, 19 hours. The crew worked continuously without sleep. January 17th. Number 3 aircraft, radar inoperative. No spare radar sets available. Removed radar from number 9 aircraft, which has cracked main spar and cannot fly. Installation took 14 hours, January 19th. Out of 50 caliber ammunition for defensive guns, borrowed 5,000 rounds from destroyer Escort. Will repay when we reach port, somehow. The logistical miracle that kept these operations running came from an unexpected source. The U.S. Navy had developed underway replenishment to a degree unprecedented in naval warfare. Oilers would rendezvous with hunter-killer groups at sea, transferring fuel while both ships steamed at 15 knots. Ammunition ships would transfer ordnance across, cables stretched between vessels. Even aircraft could be transferred, lowered from cargo ships by crane while escorts circled protectively. This meant that hunter-killer groups could remain at sea for months, limited only by crew endurance rather than fuel or ammunition. USS Bogue operated continuously from May through December 1943, a period of 7 months, returning to port only twice for brief maintenance periods. Her aircraft flew over 2,000 combat sorties during this period, more sorties than many fleet carrier air groups flew in the entire war. The human cost of this operational tempo was measured in more than casualties. Men broke under the strain in ways that weren't always obvious. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Kane commanded Composite Squadron 9 aboard USS Card during the summer of 1943. A pre-war Naval Academy graduate, Kane was considered an outstanding officer, competent, level-headed, aggressive. In August, after 2 months of continuous operations, Kane's behavior began to change. He became obsessive about patrol patterns, insisting on personally planning every mission in exhausting detail. He stopped sleeping. He would stand on the flight deck for entire missions, watching the horizon, unable to rest even when his aircraft were safely returned. On August 23rd, Kane launched in his Avenger on what was supposed to be a routine patrol. His wingmen later reported that Kane's aircraft flew erratically, wandering from the assigned search pattern, responding slowly or not at all to radio calls. 4 hours into the mission, Kane's aircraft simply flew into the ocean. No distress call, no obvious mechanical failure. The aircraft dove into the water at a shallow angle, as if Kane had simply fallen asleep or given up. Neither Kane nor his crew survived. The official investigation ruled the cause as pilot error due to fatigue. The unofficial verdict, whispered among the squadron, was that Kane had reached his limit and couldn't continue. The campaign against the U-boats was grinding down both sides through sheer attrition. But the mathematics favoured the Allies. The United States was producing escort carriers faster than Germany could build U-boats. The Casablanca class, mass-produced at Kaiser shipyards in Vancouver, Washington, rolled off the ways at a rate of 1 ship every 6 days at peak production. 50 Casablanca-class carriers were completed between July 1943 and July 1944. Not all went to the Atlantic, most were sent to the Pacific, but enough came to the Atlantic to maintain and expand the hunter-killer campaign. Germany, by contrast, was struggling to maintain U-boat production. Allied bombing had damaged shipyards and disrupted supply chains. Critical materials like copper and tungsten were increasingly scarce. Skilled workers were being drafted into the army to replace losses on the Eastern Front. The production rate, which had peaked at 30 boats per month in early 1943, had fallen to 20 boats per month by the end of the year. More critically, the training program for new crews was being shortened as losses mounted. Crews that should have received 6 months of training were going to sea after 3 months, barely competent to operate their boats, wholly unprepared for the lethal environment they would face. Korvettenkapitän Johann von Rosinski, serving as a training officer at the submarine school in Gotenhafen, wrote in a report to U-boat headquarters in November 1943 that the quality of new crews was deteriorating rapidly. These men are brave and willing, but they lack the basic competence to survive in combat. They have insufficient time to master navigation, torpedo calculations, and emergency procedures. We are sending them to their deaths. The current training program is producing victims, not warriors. Recommend immediate extension of training period to minimum 6 months, even if this means reducing monthly boat deployments. The recommendation was noted and filed. The training period remained at 3 months. Germany couldn't afford to delay. The tonnage war was being lost, and every boat mattered, even if that boat was manned by a partially trained crew that probably wouldn't survive its first patrol. The mathematics were brutal, but inescapable. Send under-trained crews to sea, and they might sink some ships before being destroyed. Keep them in port for additional training, and the merchant ships sailed unmolested. By January 1944, the transformation of the Atlantic was complete. The ocean that had been Germany's hunting ground for 4 years had become an Allied lake. U-boats still operated, still sank ships, still posed a threat. But they operated on Allied terms, in areas the Allies permitted, under conditions that made sustained operations almost impossible. The hunter-killer groups, with their Avengers launching every 4 hours, had created zones of absolute denial that U-boats could enter only at mortal risk. The statistics for January 1944 told the story with mathematical precision. German U-boats sank 19 Allied merchant ships totaling 96,000 tons. The Escort carrier groups sank 14 U-boats. The exchange rate had reversed. The Allies were sinking more submarines than the submarines were sinking ships. The tonnage war, which Dönitz had promised to win through simple arithmetic, had been lost through a different arithmetic entirely. On January 24, 1944, Oberleutnant zur See Werner Hartenstein surfaced U-156 for the last time. He had been at sea for 73 days, the longest patrol of his career and one of the longest of the war. His crew was exhausted beyond description. His batteries would no longer hold a full charge. His food supplies had run out a week earlier. He had sunk exactly 1 ship during the entire patrol, a small freighter of 4,000 tons that had been straggling behind a convoy. The ocean was empty as U-156 broke the surface. Clear skies, moderate seas, no aircraft visible. Hartenstein's lookouts scanned the horizon with the manic intensity of men who knew that death could appear at any moment. The diesel engines roared to life. The batteries began to charge. Hartenstein allowed himself a moment of hope. Perhaps they would make it. Perhaps they would reach port. Perhaps they would survive. The Avenger appeared at 1126 hours, 15 minutes after U-156 had surfaced. It came from the south, flying low, following a search pattern that had been calculated by Lieutenant Commander Isbell's operations officer 3 hours earlier. The pilot was Ensign Thomas Willis, flying his 9th mission in 72 hours. Willis was so tired he almost missed the submarine, his eyes sliding past the dark shape on the water before his brain registered what he was seeing. Willis's attack was textbook perfect. A shallow dive, 4 depth charges released at optimum spacing, detonating 50 feet deep as the submarine attempted to crash dive. U-156's stern was blown off. She sank in 90 seconds. 17 men made it out, including Hartenstein. They were picked up 3 hours later by one of Card's destroyer escorts and became prisoners of war. In his debriefing, conducted over several days at a prisoner of war camp in Virginia, Hartenstein was asked to describe how the Allies had defeated the U-boats. His answer was simple and devastating. You made the ocean too small. We could not operate because we could not surface. We could not surface because your aircraft were everywhere. I do not understand how you achieved this. You do not have enough aircraft carriers to cover the entire Atlantic, yet somehow you made it impossible for us to find safe water. This was not a tactical victory. This was a systematic victory. You changed the nature of submarine warfare itself. Hartenstein's assessment, delivered in halting English to American intelligence officers who recorded every word, captured a truth that would take naval historians decades to fully appreciate. The escort carriers hadn't won through superior technology or overwhelming force. They had won through operational tempo, through the relentless application of presence that denied the enemy the ability to operate. The concept was simple, almost mundane. Launch aircraft every 4 hours. Maintain continuous patrols. Force submarines to remain submerged. But the execution required a level of sustained effort that pushed men and machines beyond their designed limits. The architect of this system, Admiral Francis Lowe, never received the public recognition granted to fleet commanders or fighter aces. His 10th Fleet existed only on organizational charts, a headquarters staff that controlled operations without controlling ships. Yet Lowe's contribution to Allied victory rivaled that of any combat commander. He had understood that the battle against U-boats wasn't won through dramatic confrontations, but through the systematic denial of operational space. Every hour that a U-boat spent submerged was an hour it couldn't attack convoys. Every battery charge interrupted by aircraft was a patrol cut short. The cumulative effect was devastating. Lowe's operational analysis, preserved in his papers at the Naval War College, demonstrated the mathematical thinking that underpinned the hunter-killer strategy. A typical U-boat patrol lasted 8 weeks. Of those 8 weeks, the submarine spent approximately 2 weeks in transit to and from the patrol area, leaving 6 weeks on station. During those 6 weeks, the submarine needed to surface for approximately 4 hours every third day to recharge batteries, totaling 56 hours of vulnerable surface time. If Allied aircraft could force the submarine to dive even once during each surface period, the charging time would be insufficient. The submarine's effective patrol time would be cut in half, reducing its ability to find and attack convoys. The mathematics were elegant, but they required operational execution on a scale that seemed impossible. To interrupt battery charges consistently, aircraft needed to patrol every area where U-boats might surface, at intervals short enough that submarines couldn't complete a charge cycle. This meant continuous patrols, 24 hours a day, across millions of square miles of ocean. The escort carriers made it possible, but only through operational methods that violated every peacetime regulation about crew rest, maintenance schedules, and sustainable operations. Captain Daniel Gallery, commanding USS Guadalcanal during her hunter-killer operations in early 1944, pushed the operational tempo to extremes that shocked even the aggressive Admiral Lowe. Gallery believed that continuous pressure on U-boats required not just daylight patrols, but night operations that denied submarines their traditional safe period for surfacing. Night carrier operations were considered extraordinarily dangerous. Landing aircraft on a carrier deck in darkness, with minimal lighting to avoid enemy detection, was challenging enough. Doing so in the North Atlantic, with the carrier rolling and pitching in heavy seas, seemed suicidal. The Gallery ordered night operations anyway. His pilots flew modified Avengers with extra fuel tanks and no depth charges, their sole mission to locate and illuminate surfaced U-boats so that destroyer escorts could attack. The technique was crude but effective. An Avenger would locate a U-boat on radar, illuminate it with a powerful searchlight mounted in the bomb bay, and orbit overhead while radioing position reports to surface ships. The U-boat would crash dive immediately, but its position was now known. Destroyer escorts would saturate the area with depth charges, often forcing the damaged submarine to surface again. The first time Guadalcanal attempted night operations, on April 8, 1944, 2 Avengers were lost in landing accidents. The flight deck, dimly lit to avoid detection, proved nearly impossible to find in darkness. Pilots approached too high or too low, landed too fast or too slow, missed the arresting wires, and crashed into the barrier. The Gallery's air operations officer recommended suspending night operations until better lighting systems could be developed. The Gallery refused. The next night, 3 more Avengers launched into darkness. One located U-515 on the surface, 300 miles south of the Azores. The Avenger illuminated the submarine with its searchlight and maintained contact for 40 minutes while destroyers closed in. U-515 attempted to fight back, firing its deck guns at the circling aircraft, but the Avenger remained outside effective range, its searchlight turning the submarine into a brightly lit target. When the destroyers arrived, U-515 was caught on the surface, with no time to dive. Depth charges and gunfire ended the engagement in minutes. 2 nights later, on April 10th, another night patrol located U-68 recharging batteries. The same technique, searchlight illumination and destroyer attack, sent the submarine to the bottom. Gallery's willingness to accept high accident rates in exchange for around-the-clock pressure on U-boats demonstrated the brutal calculus of the anti-submarine campaign. Losing aircraft to landing accidents was acceptable if it meant denying U-boats any safe period for operations. The human stories behind these statistics revealed the personal cost of the campaign. Aviation radioman second-class James Murphy flew 63 combat missions from USS Card between July 1943 and February 1944. His personal diary, donated to the Naval Aviation Museum after his death in 1997, documented the grinding exhaustion of continuous operations. August 4th. Third mission today. Spotted nothing. So tired I fell asleep in the ready room between missions. August 7th. 4 missions in 36 hours. Saw 2 U-boats, but both crash-dived before we could attack. August 12th. Lost another aircraft today. Engine failure on takeoff. The crew was rescued, but the plane sunk. We're down to 8 operational Avengers now. August 19th. Starting to not care if we find submarines or not. I just want to sleep. Murphy's diary entries grew shorter and more fragmented as weeks turned to months. By December, individual entries consisted of single sentences or phrases. Flew. I saw nothing. Tired. The diary stopped entirely on February 9th, 1944. Murphy had been grounded by the flight surgeon for acute exhaustion and sent stateside for recovery. He never returned to combat operations. His final diary entry, written weeks after his grounding, tried to make sense of the experience. I flew 63 missions and personally sighted 4 U-boats. I don't know if any of the submarines we attacked were actually sunk. I don't know if anything I did mattered. All I know is that for 7 months we flew every day, every night when we could, regardless of weather or fatigue or fear. If that helped win the war, then it was worth it. But I don't know if I could do it again. The toll on U-boat crews was even more severe. By mid-1944, the average U-boat patrol lasted less than 4 weeks before being cut short by damage, mechanical failure, or crew exhaustion. Submarines that departed on 2-month patrols were returning after 3 weeks, with nothing to show but depleted batteries and traumatized crews. The constant threat of aircraft attack created a psychological strain that broke men in ways no amount of training could prevent. Oberleutnant zur See, Hans-Joachim Neumann, commanded U-372 during her second war patrol in May 1944. His war diary, recovered after the submarine was sunk on June 4th, revealed the progressive mental deterioration of a crew under continuous pressure. May 15th. Forced to dive 6 times today by aircraft. Batteries at 40%. Crew morale fair. May 17th. Forced to dive 11 times today. Batteries insufficient for sustained operations. Several crew members showed signs of severe stress. May 20th. Cannot surface in daylight. Night surfacing is limited to a maximum 2 hours before aircraft appear. Do not understand how they find us so quickly. Beginning to believe Allied aircraft can detect us even when submerged. May 23rd. The crew is breaking. 2 men collapsed from anxiety. Radioman hearing voices. Cannot continue patrol under these conditions. Requesting permission to abort and return to base. Permission was denied. U-372 was ordered to continue patrol and move to a new area where Allied presence might be lighter. The submarine was detected on radar by an Avenger from USS Guadalcanal on June 4th, attacked with depth charges, and sunk with all hands. Neumann's final diary entry, written on June 3rd, consisted of 3 words: "This is impossible." The impossibility Neumann described was the operational environment created by continuous carrier patrols. The escorts had made submarine warfare fundamentally unviable in large areas of the Atlantic. U-boats could still operate, but only by accepting unsustainable loss rates and minimal effectiveness. The strategic equation had reversed. In 1942, Germany needed to sink 700,000 tons of shipping monthly to win the tonnage war. By mid-1944, they were sinking less than 50,000 tons monthly, while losing submarines at a rate that made replacement impossible. Dönitz, promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy in January 1943, faced an impossible situation. Knew the U-boat campaign was failing. Intelligence reports made clear that Allied aircraft were sinking submarines faster than Germany could build them. Yet Hitler demanded that the U-boat offensive continue, insisting that submarines remained Germany's only effective naval weapon. Dönitz, caught between military reality and political necessity, continued sending submarines to sea, even as he privately acknowledged the campaign's futility. In a conference with Hitler on June 19, 1944, Dönitz presented statistics that should have ended the U-boat offensive. In May 1944, German submarines had sunk 23 Allied ships, totaling 130,000 tons. During the same month, 38 U-boats had been lost, including 15 to aircraft attacks. The exchange rate was catastrophic. Hitler's response, recorded in the conference minutes, revealed his detachment from reality. Every ship sunk delays the enemy's plans. Every U-boat that ties down Allied resources serves a purpose. The U-boat force will continue operations regardless of losses. The human cost of this policy was staggering. Between May 1943 and May 1945, Germany lost 783 U-boats. Of these, escort carrier groups accounted for 53 confirmed sinkings and participated in dozens more, where credit was shared with other forces. But the carrier group's impact far exceeded their direct kills. By maintaining continuous patrols that forced U-boats to remain submerged, they prevented submarines from reaching attack positions, depleted their batteries, demoralized their crews, and made entire ocean areas operationally untenable. The final vindication of the hunter-killer strategy came in the war's closing months. By March 1945, Allied merchant ship losses had fallen to 6 ships per month, despite over 100 U-boats still at sea. The submarines were present but ineffective, spending most of their time hiding from patrols rather than attacking convoys. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had threatened Allied victory as late as March 1943, was over. The escort carriers and their exhausted air crews had won through persistence rather than brilliance, through operational tempo rather than technological superiority. The post-war interrogations of surviving U-boat commanders revealed how completely the hunter-killer groups had dominated the psychological dimension of the campaign. Korvettenkapitän Peter Kremer, one of Germany's most successful submarine aces with 34 ships sunk, was asked during his interrogation what had defeated the U-boat force. His answer was remarkably similar to Hartenstein's. The small carriers. We called them jeep carriers, dismissed them as inferior ships with inadequate aircraft. But they were everywhere. We could not escape them. When we surfaced, they found us. When we charged batteries, they attacked us. When we tried to operate, they were there. Not sometimes, not often, always. That word, always, that is what defeated us. They were always there. The Americans, for their part, paid a price that statistics only partially captured. 53 U-boats sunk by escort carrier groups. Sounds efficient until one considers the cost. Over 40 aircraft lost to operational accidents. Nearly 200 aviators were killed in crashes and mechanical failures. Thousands of crew members pushed beyond human endurance, breaking in ways that didn't always show in official records. The victory was real, but it was purchased with years of lifespan lost to exhaustion, marriages broken by absence, mental health damaged by continuous stress. Lieutenant Commander Arnold Isbell, who had pioneered many of the hunter-killer tactics aboard USS Card, was promoted to captain and given command of the fleet carrier USS Franklin in January 1945. On March 19, 1945, Franklin was hit by 2 Japanese bombs off the coast of Japan. The carrier suffered catastrophic damage, becoming the most heavily damaged carrier to survive the war. 807 men died, including Isbell, who was killed on the bridge during the initial attack. He was 42 years old. His contribution to winning the Battle of the Atlantic was largely forgotten in the aftermath of Franklin's dramatic survival, but his operational methods had changed naval warfare forever. The escort carriers themselves had brief post-war careers. Most were decommissioned between 1946 and 1947, deemed obsolete in an era of jet aircraft and nuclear weapons. USS Bogue, the pioneer hunter-killer carrier, was scrapped in 1960. USS Card was sold for scrap in 1971. USS Guadalcanal, famous for capturing U-505 intact in June 1944, was scrapped in 1966. These ships, which had turned the tide of the Atlantic campaign, vanished into history with minimal recognition. The Avenger aircraft fared slightly better, serving into the 1950s as anti-submarine patrol planes before being replaced by more modern designs. But the operational methods developed by the escort carrier groups survived and evolved. The concept of continuous aerial presence over vital ocean areas became fundamental to post-war anti-submarine doctrine. During the Cold War, carrier-based patrol aircraft maintained round-the-clock surveillance of Soviet submarine bases, using the same techniques that had defeated the U-boats: launch aircraft every few hours, maintain overlapping search patterns, deny the enemy safe operating areas. The tactics that had seemed impossible in 1942 were standard procedure by 1960. The legacy of the hunter-killer campaign appears in unexpected places. Modern naval aviation, with its emphasis on sustained operations and crew endurance, traces directly to the practices developed by escort carrier crews in the Atlantic. The maintenance procedures that allow carriers to maintain high operational tempo for months without port calls, the crew rotation systems that prevent exhaustion, the logistical methods that enable underway replenishment, all were refined during the Battle of the Atlantic. The lessons learned came at tremendous cost, but they transformed naval aviation from a tactical weapon into a strategic capability. The U-boat commanders who survived the war carried their experiences into Germany's post-war naval force. The Bundesmarine, West Germany's Cold War Navy, included several former U-boat officers in senior positions. They brought with them a profound respect for air power's ability to dominate ocean areas. German naval doctrine in the Cold War emphasized that submarines could only operate effectively if they could deny enemy aircraft the ability to maintain continuous patrols. This recognition, born from defeat in the Atlantic, shaped how NATO navies thought about anti-submarine warfare throughout the Cold War. The mathematical elegance of the hunter-killer strategy continues to fascinate military analysts. Lowe's realization that denying operational space mattered more than inflicting casualties represented a fundamental shift in strategic thinking. Traditional naval doctrine focused on destroying enemy forces. Lowe focused on preventing enemy forces from operating effectively. The distinction seems subtle, but proved decisive. You don't need to sink every submarine if you can force every submarine to remain submerged and unable to attack. You don't need to patrol every square mile of ocean if you can patrol enough square miles that submarines can never be certain of finding safe water. This concept, operational denial through continuous presence, has applications far beyond anti-submarine warfare. Modern counter-terrorism operations use similar principles, maintaining continuous surveillance that prevents enemies from operating freely, even if complete elimination proves impossible. Cybersecurity employs analogous strategies, using constant monitoring to make hostile actions difficult, even when absolute prevention is unattainable. The escort carrier campaign of 1943 to 45 provided a historical proof of concept for operational strategies that remain relevant 8 decades later. The human dimension of the campaign resists neat analysis. How does one measure the cost of pushing young men beyond their limits? What is the value of 7 months without adequate sleep? What are the long-term consequences of constant fear? The veterans who survived rarely spoke about these aspects. Their memoirs, when they wrote them, focused on tactical details and successful attacks. The exhaustion, the fear, the moments of breakdown, these remained private. Yet occasionally, in oral histories recorded decades after the war, glimpses appeared. Robert Henderson, the chief machinist who kept Guadalcanal's aircraft flying through improvisation and desperation, was interviewed in 1992 by the Naval Institute. Asked about his wartime service, Henderson paused for a long time before answering. "We did what was necessary. I'm proud of that. But I'm also relieved I never had to do it again. There were nights I thought I would simply fall over and die from exhaustion. There were mornings I couldn't remember the previous day because I'd been too tired to form memories. We kept the aircraft flying because that's what was required. But if someone asked me to do it again, I don't know if I could. I don't know if anyone could." The final statistics tell a story that both sides would have found unbelievable in 1942. Between May 1943 and May 1945, Allied merchant ship losses in the Atlantic dropped 92% compared to the first 4 years of war. U-boat losses increased 200%. The tonnage war that Dönitz had been certain Germany would win through arithmetic was lost through a different arithmetic, one that counted patrol hours and battery charges and the cumulative effect of never allowing the enemy a moment of safety. Of the 11 American escort carriers that fought U-boats in the Atlantic, only one was lost in combat. USS Block Island was torpedoed by U-549 on May 29, 1944. 6 crew members died. The submarine that sank her was hunted down and destroyed by Block Island's escorts within hours. The exchange rate, 1 carrier and 6 lives for a submarine and its entire crew of 49, encapsulated the mathematics of the campaign. The Allies could afford to lose carriers and men at rates the Germans couldn't match. More importantly, the Americans could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. The escort carriers themselves were proof of industrial warfare's logic. USS Casablanca, lead ship of her class, was built in 6 months from keel laying to commissioning. Germany took 18 months to build a Type 7C U-boat. America built 50 Casablanca-class carriers in 1 year. Germany built 160 Type 7C submarines in the same period. The math was simple. America's shipbuilding capacity exceeded Germany's by a factor that made the outcome inevitable once the United States fully mobilized. But the escort carriers weren't just products of industrial capacity. They were instruments of operational doctrine that transformed superior numbers into strategic dominance. Having 50 carriers meant nothing if they couldn't be used effectively. The genius of the hunter-killer strategy was that it found a way to use small, limited carriers to achieve results that should have required much larger forces. By accepting high operational tempo, by pushing crews beyond normal limits, by improvising maintenance procedures that kept aircraft flying, the Americans turned quantity into quality. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of the escort carrier campaign in the Battle of the Atlantic endures in every modern naval operation that requires sustained presence over vast ocean areas. The techniques developed by exhausted crews on small carriers in 1943 became doctrine for fleet carriers in Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. The maintenance procedures that kept Avengers flying despite impossible conditions evolved into the complex logistics systems that support modern carrier air wings. The operational tempo that nearly broke the first generation of carrier aviators became the expected standard for their successors. Werner Hartenstein survived the war and returned to Germany in 1946. He never went to sea again. In interviews conducted in the 1970s, he was asked if he bore any resentment toward the Americans who had defeated him. His answer revealed the strange respect that warriors sometimes develop for their enemies. They did what we could not. They found a way to be everywhere at once. They turned the ocean, which should have been our domain, into their domain. I do not resent them for this. I respect them. They won not through superior weapons or better submarines, but through superior will. They were willing to pay the price in exhaustion and sacrifice that victory required. We were not. That is why they won. The story of escort carriers hunting U-boats lacks the drama of carrier battles in the Pacific or the visceral impact of infantry combat. There are no iconic images, no moments that captured public imagination, no individuals who became household names. The campaign was conducted far from witnesses, in empty ocean, by exhausted men whose greatest accomplishment was maintaining presence day after day, week after week, month after month. Their victory was measured in merchant ships that arrived safely, in convoys that crossed unmolested, in U-boats that returned to port having accomplished nothing. Yet this unglamorous campaign mattered as much as any battle of the war. Without the food, fuel, and equipment carried across the Atlantic, Britain couldn't have survived, and the invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The U-boats had come close to severing this lifeline in 1942 and early 1943. That they failed, that the Atlantic remained open, that the supplies continued to flow, was due in large measure to small carriers launching aircraft every 4 hours, maintaining a presence that seemed impossible but proved decisive. The mathematics that Dönitz had been so certain would deliver victory through tonnage calculations were defeated by a different mathematics. The arithmetic of operational tempo, the geometry of search patterns, the calculus of cumulative exhaustion. Numbers that measured not ships sunk, but hours of sustained pressure, not submarines destroyed, but patrol areas denied. In the end, the escort carriers won because they made the ocean too small for U-boats to hide, too dangerous for submarines to operate, too hostile for Germany's underwater weapons to accomplish its mission. The men who flew those endless patrols, who maintained those temperamental aircraft, who launched and recovered in all weather, who worked until they collapsed, these men won the Atlantic, not through moments of heroism, though those occurred, but through sustained competence under impossible conditions. Their memorial is not in bronze or marble, but in the maritime commerce that still flows freely across the ocean they made safe. Every cargo ship that crosses the Atlantic, every container full of goods, every passenger who flies over those waters travels in safety, because young men in 1943 decided that launch cycles every 4 hours, regardless of exhaustion or weather or fear, were possible after all.